The first time I saw her, she smiled and said, "Don't call me ma'am here." I didn't know then how much those words would change the way I saw her and myself. I still remember the first day I walked into her classroom, the sunlight spilling in through tall, dusty windows, dust motes dancing in the golden haze. My heart had that familiar nervous flutter I always felt on the first day of a new course, but it was nothing compared to the quiet shock I felt when I saw her. She was standing at the front of the room, a presence so calm it almost seemed to absorb the chatter of students around her. Her hair fell just past her shoulders, a soft brown with threads of gold catching the light. She tucked a loose strand behind her ear, her fingers brushing the side of her face in a gesture so ordinary yet profoundly intimate that I couldn't look away. Her eyes met mine for a brief second, and the simplest of gestures, a tilt of her head, the faint curve of her lips, sent a shiver through me. There was a quiet elegance in her movements, the kind that didn't demand attention but somehow claimed it all the same. The silk of her scarf whispered against her neck as she moved, and the faint scent of warm vanilla lingered just enough to be noticed without being overpowering. I caught myself taking in the details, the way she adjusted her glasses, the steady rhythm of her breath, the gentle sway of her posture as she gestured toward the chalkboard. Sitting down, I felt a flutter of anticipation I hadn't expected. She didn't notice, or perhaps she did, but chose to remain professionally distant. But I could feel the pull, the almost magnetic sense that this woman was going to matter far more than any class, any lecture, any assignment. My notebook felt heavier in my hands, not because of the weight of paper, but because of the weight of her presence. When she spoke, her voice was measured, calm, and quietly commanding. There was no arrogance in it, only the kind of natural authority that made people listen without realizing they were doing it. I watched the subtle ways she interacted with other students, small smiles, polite nods, the way she leaned slightly toward those who asked questions. Every movement felt deliberate, every expression layered with unspoken meaning. I couldn't shake the awareness that she was married, older, untouchable in ways I wasn't entirely prepared to define. And yet, for some reason, the thought of her seemed less like a barrier and more like a pull I couldn't resist. My chest tightened with a mixture of admiration and longing, emotions I barely understood. By the time the lecture ended, I left the room with my mind still lingering on her. The way her smile had held just a fraction of warmth for me. The way her presence made the air feel different. There was no overt interaction, no flirtation, nothing scandalous. Just the quiet, almost imperceptible connection of two people noticing each other, of one presence quietly embedding itself into the other's memory. And yet, in that brief hour, I knew I would return to this classroom not just for the lessons, but for her. The subtle grace, the calm intelligence, the mysterious warmth I couldn't stop thinking about. That first glance had already set something in motion, something slow and insistent, something I couldn't yet name, but would soon feel in every heartbeat. After that first lecture, I lingered near the classroom door, pretending to check my notes, though my eyes kept darting toward her. Most of the students had already filed out, leaving a quiet space where the afternoon light pooled in the corners of the room. My heart pounded, not from the thought of asking a question, but from the simple proximity to her, from the knowledge that she was real, tangible, and impossibly close. "Can I help you with something?" she asked, her voice soft but carrying that same quiet authority I couldn't forget. She stepped closer to the desk, and for a brief instant, our shoulders brushed. The contact was accidental, or so it seemed, but it sent a surprising warmth through me, a subtle electric tension that made me want to linger in that space a little longer. I asked my question, fumbling over words I normally spoke with ease, and she smiled, a small, knowing curve of her lips that made me aware of every subtle detail of her face. Her eyes held mine, steady and curious, and for a moment I felt almost exposed in the most comforting way. It wasn't just that she was looking at me, it was that she seemed to genuinely care what I thought, what I wanted to understand. As she leaned closer to explain, I noticed how the sunlight caught the highlights in her hair, how the faint scent of vanilla followed her movements. Her hand brushed mine, not deliberately, just a gentle, fleeting touch as she pointed to a phrase in my notebook. And yet, that fleeting contact lingered in my mind long after she pulled away. My pulse had picked up, my thoughts tangled in the simplest, most human fascination. There was a moment when we both paused, looking at the same line of text. She laughed softly, a sound that seemed to vibrate against the quiet of the empty classroom. "You're overthinking it," she said lightly, though her eyes sparkled in a way that suggested amusement rather than admonishment. I felt a blush rise to my cheeks, though she didn't comment on it. In that brief conversation, I became aware of the delicate tension that would shape every encounter with her from that day forward. Every gesture, every glance, every shift in posture carried meaning I couldn't fully interpret but couldn't ignore. Her confidence was tempered with a subtle vulnerability, a grace that made her feel both untouchable and profoundly human at the same time. As I gathered my notebook and prepared to leave, she gave me a fleeting, almost imperceptible smile, a silent acknowledgement of our shared moment. It wasn't romantic in any overt sense, not yet, but the air between us seemed charged, alive with the possibility of something deeper. I left the classroom with the faint scent of her perfume still in my mind, her soft voice echoing in my chest, and a quiet, insistent curiosity that I knew would not fade. Walking down the hallway, I realized that something fundamental had shifted. She was no longer just a professor, a figure of authority. She had become a presence I would seek, consciously or not, a quiet gravity pulling me toward her with every lecture, every conversation, every passing day. That first conversation had been simple, fleeting, and entirely innocent, but it had planted the first seed of something slow, something irresistible, and something entirely my own. I hadn't expected to see her outside of campus. Yet there she was, sitting at a small cafe table near the window, a book open in front of her, and a cup of tea steaming gently in the morning sunlight. My first instinct was to hesitate, unsure if I should interrupt her solitude, but something in the way she looked up and offered a polite, curious smile made me take a step closer. "Mind if I join you?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. She gestured toward the empty chair across from her, and I felt the strange mix of nervousness and anticipation that always came with being near her. The warmth of the sun pooled over us, catching the subtle highlights in her hair and casting gentle shadows across her face. There was something deceptively casual in the way she sat, legs crossed, book resting in her lap, yet I could sense the quiet command in her presence. We talked about ordinary things at first, literature, favorite films, the oddities of academic life. Her laugh was soft, deliberate, and somehow magnetic. It wasn't loud, but it resonated with a warmth I hadn't noticed in the classroom. When she leaned forward to emphasize a point, the faint scent of vanilla and something musky, the faintness of her perfume, reached me, grounding me in the moment more than the words themselves. At one point, I laughed at something she said, and she tilted her head with a playful smile. "And remember," she said lightly, "don't call me ma'am here." There was a teasing edge to it, subtle but unmistakable, and I felt a blush rise to my cheeks. Her eyes lingered on mine just long enough to make me aware of the unsaid tension, the silent acknowledgement that this was different from the structured, professional environment of the classroom. Our hands brushed as she reached for her tea. The contact was fleeting, almost accidental, yet electric in its simplicity. It was a touch that carried neither intent nor impropriety, but it left a warmth that lingered, making me conscious of every movement, every small gesture she made. Even sitting across from her, the space between us seemed charged with possibility, an unspoken connection that neither of us forced, yet both felt. I realized, with a quiet pang of fascination and longing, that these small, ordinary moments carried more weight than any lecture or assignment. Her presence was magnetic in ways I couldn't rationalize. There was a subtle vulnerability beneath her confident exterior, glimpsed only in the softness of her eyes when she talked about books, or the way her lips curved when she smiled at something only I seemed to notice. By the time we parted, the warmth of the cafe and the sunlight had imprinted itself on my memory, just as her presence had. I left with a sense of anticipation I couldn't shake, a mixture of admiration, quiet longing, and the knowledge that this connection, however subtle, was real. The simple phrase, "Don't call me ma'am here," lingered in my mind, a key to a door I wasn't yet ready to enter but couldn't stop thinking about. And as I walked away, I understood something essential. The world outside the classroom could be just as intimate, just as charged, as the space where our professional lives intersected. With her, even a brief encounter became a lesson in noticing, in feeling, and in understanding the gravity of a presence that demanded attention without demanding anything at all. It was late afternoon when she suggested a walk after class. The campus had emptied, leaving golden lights spilling across the paths and trees, and the air smelled faintly of damp earth and early autumn leaves. I followed at a measured pace, careful not to seem intrusive, though my heart kept a restless rhythm, drawn to her in ways I didn't fully understand. We walked in silence for a few moments, the kind that feels comfortable but also charged, until she finally spoke. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing enough," she said, her voice quieter than usual, almost as if confessing to herself. I glanced at her, noticing the subtle furrow of her brow, the slight tension in her shoulders. In the classroom, she carried a calm authority. Here, walking among the shadows of trees and the warmth of the fading sun, I saw vulnerability, a quiet, unspoken weight she carried. She spoke about balancing her career and family, about the pressures that came with expectations, and the guilt that clung to moments when she felt she was falling short. I listened, silently, carefully, aware of the trust in her voice. It was rare, this openness. Most people never shared such layers, and yet here she was, revealing fragments of herself I hadn't been meant to see. At one point, I reached out instinctively, brushing my hand against her forearm. She didn't pull away. Instead, her skin was warm beneath my fingers, grounding me in the moment, connecting us in a quiet, human way that words couldn't capture. The gesture wasn't romantic in any overt sense, but it was intimate, a subtle acknowledgement of care and presence. My chest tightened, a mix of nervousness and an almost sweet ache, knowing this trust was delicate, profound, and entirely earned. We paused near a small fountain, the gentle trickle of water filling the space between us. I noticed the soft shift of her weight, the curve of her hand as she tucked hair behind her ear, the way sunlight kissed her features, highlighting the quiet strength behind her vulnerability. There was a serenity in her voice now, a mixture of relief and lingering tension, as if she had unburdened a small piece of the weight she carried every day. I wanted to say something, anything that could make her feel lighter, but words felt inadequate. Instead, I offered a steady presence, my gaze attentive, my hand brushing hers again in a gesture meant to reassure. She gave me a small, fleeting smile, and I felt the unspoken connection deepen, a quiet intimacy forged not by grand declarations, but by shared understanding. As we resumed walking, the golden light fading into the soft hues of evening, I realized that this moment had changed something between us. The admiration I had felt before had deepened into something more nuanced, respect, care, and a delicate longing tempered by awareness of the boundaries we could not cross. And yet, the possibility of something unspoken lingered in the quiet rhythm of our steps, in the brush of her hand, in the softness of her eyes that held a vulnerability she shared only with me. By the time we parted, I carried a new understanding. The real connection wasn't in fleeting touches or stolen glances alone. It was in the trust, in the quiet confessions, in the moments where silence spoke louder than words, and in the steady warmth of a presence that promised more than it revealed. It started with an email, a simple, professional request about assisting her with a research project. I had expected correspondence, maybe a quick meeting in her office, but when she suggested I come by her home office to discuss some of the finer points, I felt a flicker of anticipation I hadn't prepared for. The walk to her apartment was uneventful, but every step felt charged with a quiet tension. My mind replayed small details from our previous encounters, the curve of her smile, the warmth in her voice, the way her presence seemed to occupy space in a way that drew attention without asking for it. I reminded myself to stay grounded, professional, but the thrill of being invited into her personal space, her world, was impossible to ignore. When she opened the door, she greeted me with that same gentle, knowing smile. Her hair was pulled back loosely, strands escaping to frame her face, and her eyes held that curious, soft warmth I'd come to recognize. The faint scent of her perfume, vanilla with a hint of musk, was immediate and grounding, filling the air as I stepped inside. I realized then how intensely aware I had become of her presence, how the smallest details, how she moved, how she breathed, even how she gestured, seemed to hold meaning I couldn't quite decipher. The apartment was quiet, organized in a way that reflected her character. Thoughtful, elegant, understated. She gestured toward a chair across from her desk, and as I sat down, I noticed how close we were in the small space. When she reached across to show me a document, our hands brushed. The contact was brief, seemingly incidental, yet it left a warmth that lingered far longer than it should have. I felt the pulse of my own heartbeat in a way that made me acutely conscious of her nearness. Our conversation was casual at first, focused on research data, references, and the logistics of her project. Yet beneath the words, there was a subtle rhythm to our interaction. Lingering glances, quiet pauses, the occasional brush of hands as she passed me papers or pointed to notes. Every gesture carried a tension that was both thrilling and terrifying. It was the kind of tension that didn't need to be spoken. It existed in the space between us, in the unspoken acknowledgement of mutual curiosity and respect. At one point, she leaned slightly closer, explaining a complex point. The warmth of her body was close enough that I could feel it, subtle but grounding, and the faint brush of her hair against my arm made me aware of the fragile intimacy that seemed to exist just beyond professional boundaries. Yet she maintained a careful, deliberate decorum, reminding me that every moment we shared was layered with unspoken limits. By the time I left, I carried more than knowledge of her project. I carried the memory of her presence, the subtle warmth of her touch, the quiet intensity in her gaze, the way she made even a professional encounter feel profoundly personal. That evening, as I walked home, I realized that the quiet invitation to her home had shifted something between us. It was no longer just admiration, no longer just curiosity. Something had begun, slow and insistent, delicate and real, a connection that would pull at me in ways I hadn't anticipated. The rain began softly, a steady patter against the windows of her office, turning the familiar space into something intimate and suspended in time. I hadn't expected to stay late, but neither of us had noticed how quickly the hours had passed, engrossed in discussion, debate, and the quiet rhythm of being near each other. Now, with the world outside blurred by sheets of rain, everything between us felt amplified. Each word, each glance, each subtle shift in posture. I leaned against her desk, nervously shifting my weight, aware of the small space that separated us. The room smelled faintly of tea and the same vanilla undertone of her perfume I had come to recognize. It was comforting yet stirring, grounding yet unsettling, pulling me toward her in ways I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. I should probably say this. I started, my voice quieter than I intended, almost swallowed by the rhythm of the rain. She looked up, curiosity flickering in her eyes, and the way her gaze held mine made my chest tighten. I admire you more than I probably should, not just as my professor, or even as a brilliant person, but you, all of you. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. She leaned back, her hand resting near mine on the desk, close enough that I could feel the subtle warmth radiating from her skin. Her eyes softened, and I could see a flicker of the same hesitation mirrored in my own reflection, awareness of boundaries, the weight of her marriage, and yet, a vulnerability I hadn't expected. She reached out, brushing a stray strand of hair behind my ear. The touch was fleeting, almost accidental, yet electric. I felt the pulse of her presence, the warmth of her hand, the quiet steadiness that made my heart pound and my thoughts scatter at once. I felt something too, she admitted softly, her voice a mixture of caution and sincerity. But it's complicated. And I can't. We have to be careful. Her words should have made me retreat, but instead, they grounded me. They confirmed that the tension, the attraction, the curiosity that had been building for weeks was not one-sided. And yet, the awareness of reality, the constraints, the life she had built, the line we could not cross, hung in the air like heavy rain clouds outside. We sat in silence for a long moment, the only sound the gentle rhythm of the rain, the soft ticking of the clock, and our own breathing. My hand hovered near hers, unsure whether to reach out or honor the unspoken boundary. The room was full of tension, yes, but it was tender too. Every glance, every micro-movement carrying volumes of emotion that words could never capture. When I finally spoke, it was with quiet conviction. "I don't expect anything. I just needed you to know." She nodded, her fingers brushing briefly against mine as she did. That touch, light, intentional, but restrained, was everything and nothing at the same time, a fleeting connection that left my chest warm and heavy. As the rain continued to fall outside, we sat there, bound by honesty, unspoken longing, and the understanding that what we felt could exist in these small, quiet moments without needing to be anything more. It was the peak of everything that had been building. Intimacy, vulnerability, and the undeniable pull between us, all held gently in a fragile, YouTube-friendly tension. When the rain had finally slowed to a gentle drizzle, I found myself standing at her door. The soft patter of leftover raindrops on the pavement echoed the rhythm of my pulse, which had been unsettled all afternoon. Inside, the warm glow of her apartment contrasted with the cool, damp world outside, wrapping us in a quiet intimacy that felt almost sacred. She opened the door and greeted me with that familiar, knowing smile. There was no trace of awkwardness, no pretense, just the calm confidence I had admired from the very beginning, tempered now by a subtle vulnerability that only I had been allowed to witness. The scent of her perfume, soft and floral with a hint of musk, greeted me immediately, pulling me back into the gentle gravity of her presence. We lingered at the threshold, neither rushing to speak nor move. It was as if the world had compressed into this singular moment of quiet awareness. She reached out, her hand brushing briefly against mine, a fleeting touch that carried warmth, reassurance, and a quiet acknowledgement of everything we had shared. I felt my chest tighten, a mix of longing and contentment, realizing that this simple contact said more than any words could. "Don't call me ma'am here," she whispered, the words soft yet deliberate, the same phrase that had haunted my thoughts since our first cafe encounter. Her eyes held mine, steady and full of unspoken meaning. That single line was no longer teasing or playful. It was an invitation, a subtle recognition of the connection between us, a shared secret that existed outside the rules and expectations of our daily lives. I leaned slightly forward, and she stepped closer. Our embrace was gentle, restrained, and yet profoundly intimate. Her head rested lightly against my chest, her hair brushing against my shoulder, and her hand pressed softly to my arm. I could feel the quiet steadiness of her heartbeat beneath my palm, a rhythm that mirrored the slow, deliberate beat of my own. It was a hug that carried gratitude, trust, and an unspoken promise, a connection that needed no labels, no declarations, no crossing of lines. When we finally pulled apart, our eyes lingered, speaking volumes in silence. I felt a warmth spread through me, not just from the physical contact, but from the emotional closeness we had nurtured, step by step, in the small moments that had led us here. The rain outside had stopped entirely, leaving a faint scent of wet earth in the air, mingling with the familiar aroma of her perfume, a sensory reminder of what had passed and what might continue. As I stepped away, I realized that the story was not in a grand gesture or a dramatic confession. It was in the accumulation of small, meaningful moments, a shared laugh, a brushed hand, a lingering glance, the quiet acknowledgement of mutual understanding and respect. That was where the intimacy lay, steady, patient, warm, and profoundly human. Walking away, I carried the echo of her presence with me, the gentle pull of connection, and the quiet certainty that our story, though constrained by circumstance, was real. It existed in every glance, every smile, every pause, and every touch that said more than words ever could. And that, I realized, was enough.